Hello, welcome to Graphic Policy Radio, where comics and politics meet. This is your host, Elon 11, and this is a comics podcast for folks who know that Stanley's life story is where objective truth goes to die. Which is why it's so important to have a fabulous, well-researched, and intriguing biography of the man written and released. That's right. Today I have on Abraham Riesman to talk about his new book. Abraham Riesman is a journalist whose work has appeared in Vulture, The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, New York Magazine, The Boston Globe, and many other outlets. He is the author of True Believer, The Rise and Fall of Stanley, and the forthcoming Ringmaster, The Life and Times of Vince McMahon. He lives in Rhode Island with his partner, the journalist S.I. Rosenbaum, and his website is Abraham Riesman, and his Twitter handle is Abraham Joseph. Welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. I'm a big fan of yours.
Oh, likewise. I was so happy to hear about this book coming out. I felt like we needed sort of a new Stanley biography that was like driven by a historical perspective and understanding of how this is all very political with a capital P and a lowercase p and all that good stuff. And I loved your earlier writing about him.
Oh, thank you. I'm curious. When did you hear about the book? Like, how did I tell you, or how did you first hear about it?
I don't remember if you told me or if you said something on Twitter. Like
Something
literally
like that.
Don't remember.
No, I was just curious because I've been interested in. I know I'm taking over the interview before we even really started it, but I'm always interested in sort of the information pathways that lead people to find out that I exist. Just for whatever reason, that kind of information intrigues me, and it's also very hard to find that out. So I'm always curious about I know it sounds vain, but it's just fascinating to me if I say, like, when did you first learn that I existed?
This is interesting. This is a good origin story. So the first time you came on my radar was when you wrote that Captain America essay that we don't like. And what I like and respected about you was that when my friend / frequent co-host on the podcast, Stephen Adwell, explained why you were wrong, you were like, I see what you're talking about. Like, yeah. To have someone actually listen to, a historian explain something, disagree, and be like, oh, you might be right. That never happens in comics.
Yeah, I know. I look. Yeah, it's unfortunate, but I try to put. Well, anyway, yes, thank you.
I mean, so to me, that's like it's like bigger to have been wrong and been like, no, I'm going to internalize this than it is to have never admitted any kind of
I feel like that's the only healthy way to live, that's just the way I've tried to approach things. So anyway, well, I'm glad that's an interesting inroad. I know a lot of people who first learned about me when I wrote that objectionable Captain America essay, who I then became friends with, and some now I'm no longer friends with. So the story goes on, but it was a big seminal moment where a lot of people in fandom sort of became aware of me for not great reasons, but it was still an in point where I met a lot of people because, like you say, I really wanted to learn from the criticism because, I hadn't put that much thought into the article. Not that I did, whatever. I just was letting my emotions take over, and I was not doing the kind of research that I probably should have done into the ins and outs of what people have said about Captain America in fandom. So once I learned all of that, I really thought differently about it. And then, in 2016, I wrote an essay where I just apologized for it. It's the only time I've ever written an article where I just sort of out and out go back on what I said. I mean, it was a really humbling experience, and I feel like it taught me a lot about how to act on the internet. Whether it's writing an article or being on Twitter or whatever, that whole experience, especially seeing in 2016, there being some degree of reconciliation with a lot of people who'd been alienated by that initial essay. I was just like, oh, this is a better way to live your life rather than I'm going to have a hot take and just not give up on it, even if I start to have my doubts about whether I was on the money,
Yeah. And, when I'm thinking about it, it feels like, when you wrote a biography of Stanley, which is just going to be an incredibly controversial topic. with, just a lot of, there's, folks from generations older than us who have a particular
Yeah.
analysis. And we're at a moment in history where some of the folks who were there are no longer with us. And it's
Yeah.
complicated. I mean, it feels like it's probably good practice for then
Oh,
doing the
yeah.
Stanley biography.
Sure. Well, that's the thing is, occasionally I'll sort of laugh at some bit of, abuse or conflict that's happening. But for the most part, I try to not put people on blast, because I'm big on the mute button, as opposed to, the quote tweet button, so I can just dunk on somebody.
Yeah.
I just feel like the more you can defuse situations, the better it is for literally everybody involved. And I don't blame people for going off the handle, really, because all of these apps and systems are designed to make you want to fly off the handle. But still, if you can avoid it, it's much more of a win-win scenario. So yeah, when it comes to the Stan Lee book, of course there are going to be people who are very upset about it. And my hope, it's probably not the most well-founded hope, is I would hope that a lot of them, a sufficient number of them maybe, would actually read the book and see that a lot of what they think about it is not really there. I mean, I've seen little rumblings here and there from people who are upset, saying I'm trying to cancel Stan Lee or something, which is it's just
silly.
It's silly. I mean, it gets at that binary that we have with celebrity culture that I just can't stand, where it's either somebody is a perfect golden god or they're getting canceled. If you put any criticism toward anybody, you're canceling that person. So, I'm sure there are people who, not knowing anything about my book, because they haven't read it yet. Barely anybody has. It's not out yet. Perhaps they'll I don't know. Somebody will tell them that I'm not just damning Stan Lee. It's all about living with ambiguity, and that's hard to do. People really want to have those binaries, that polarity.
And, I have read the entire book. I didn't even know that if I would have time to read the entire book between when you sent it to me and now. I have not actually gotten to sleep because I'm super hooked.
Oh, really?
Oh my God. I read the whole damn thing. Absolutely.
Thank
even though I did not say to myself that was a thing that was definitely going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I really enjoyed it. You are approaching it with my take on this reality. And so of who he was, what ended up happening, his relation with Kirby and Ditko, etc. So it's we are from the same camp, but I thought it was just really complete and excellent and sensitively written. And I was sad when I read the ending, because it is sad what happened with Stanley at the end of his life, regardless of whatever else he may have done to other people. That's still terrible. Yeah. So I don't think I've seen anything that was this complete, certainly, before. And I know that there have been books that have come out that are just hagiography and just, it's frustrating.
It is frustrating. Yeah. I mean, one of the reasons I like you is we both agree that the comics medium and the superhero genre really merit serious scholarship and serious journalism, and people just don't put time and money into, or institutional either funds or support for good comics journalism and comics history. It's kind of left to people who have day jobs and have to cram it in, and these are really consequential questions. These are not small matters from a niche for a niche audience. You're talking about the fate of empires and, the way that the entire entertainment economy and a significant portion of the actual economy are built. And that comes out of the comics world, especially recently. And my hope is that this book can be, I hope people like the book, but I also hope that if it does well, which, Bezrat Hashem will happen, there might be more demand and institutional support for serious scholarship and journalism about the comics medium industry and the superhero industrial complex,
You're right. This has huge bearing on the superhero industrial complex. You're right. Absolutely. And one of the but starting from sort of the earlier part of the book, one of the things that you did that was just so exciting to me was you actually did research into the Romanian family origins of Stanley's predecessor, Stanley's family, and we're both Jews of Eastern European extraction, and so much of the comics history story is particular to the experience of our people in New York. And I don't think anyone had looked at and what was the specific people in our story before they came to this country.
Yeah, I mean, I'll confess, I still haven't even done the degree of research into my own family that I ended up doing. I've tried, but there's less information out there for whatever reason. I'm currently working with a genealogist to crack through that. But that same genealogist I worked with initially for the Stanley book, for True Believer, because there were, databases and ways to look that I just would never know. And it was really important to me that I get the genealogy and the information about Romanian Jewish life at the turn of the 20th century in there. So I worked with this genealogist who really helped a lot. And also I hired researchers in Romania to look through Romanian source materials. And it just, at times I was like, why am I doing this? And then most of the time though, I was like, I feel like it's important to not just for telling this story, but I almost sort of want it to prompt people to think about doing that with their own families. It's like once you start researching genealogy of other families from a similar origin to your own, even though there are always stark differences, it just puts into relief the fact that you have this whole family history that maybe is not really documented anywhere, especially if you're Jewish.
Mm-hmm. Especially if you're Jewish. Yeah, I've done a lot of stuff with, I volunteer a lot with the Jack Kirby Museum and Institute, Research Institute. And so I knew more about Kirby, but I don't know anything about, the Kirby family back in the Palo settlement, and with Stan being Romanian, that is not, there's a significant Romanian Jewish, folks here, but it's not the biggest population.
No.
And so there's a niche nature of it as well.
Yeah,
most American Jews are from Russia originally. So,
the broader definition of Russia,
yes, the Soviet,
and maybe Poland, which of course is often part of other countries.
No, we're not. We were all fucking. I'm Polish. We were all fucking killed, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, never mind then.
Yep.
Never mind.
We're all fucking Russian. Yeah. We're all. It's all Russians. Anyway.
Fair enough. Anyway, we're getting to the good stuff now. But yeah, the point was, you're exactly right. It's this small population, and I feel like the specificity was really important to get. And at first, it just sort of started out as a hunch. I was like, well, it would be nice to get some of this information. And then the more I found out, the more I really couldn't stop looking. And the other thing that really tipped me off on that was talking to Larry Lieber, who is Stan's brother, who is still alive. And he didn't really know anything about the Romanian Jew, the actual Romania-based origins of his parents. He actually knew very little about his parents' past, but he talked about the way their father, Jack Lieber, born Janku Ern Lieber, approached Jewishness, his own Jewish identity and the Jewish community. And it was so starkly different from Stan that I just went, I feel like there's something here. What was Jewishness to Jack Lieber? What did that mean, and how did that contrast to what it meant for Stan Lee? And the research took a while to accumulate everything, and eventually I was just really glad that was that Larry had brought that up, and that had really lodged itself in my brain, because I don't think you can understand a person if you don't understand the circumstances from which they emerged. And the Romanian aspect was it's not like you and me where it would be distant. It's, this was Stan's parents. I mean, he's born in 1922, and his dad showed up, I'm bad at math, 15 years earlier, Yeah. So anyway, thank you for being interested in that, because it was something I thought was really interesting as well.
Yeah, and the ties to the theater, particularly as a source of American Yiddish popular culture, connects to me as well. And it kind of made me think about, one of the questions, I got some questions that I got my own questions, but I did have one of the questions that was sent by friend of the show, Spencer Ackerman, journalist Spencer Ackerman.
Yeah. Oh man, he asked the questions. Oh my God.
Which ties into this in an interesting way. So he hadn't read your book yet because it's like not officially released yet. But he said, how is it that of all of the Stan and Jack creations, even presuming that this is mostly Jack and less Stan, because how is it that the one thing that they can't make work is the fucking X-Men, to quote Spencer here. Like, this is the one that is most directly deals with their Jewish experience, their daily lives, and instead they run from the metaphor, making it a weird thing about atomic anxiety instead of, the greatest idea in all of comics emerging from their direct pain. Is it assimilationist cringe, something Philip Roth would recognize? And reading your book, I have theory on this.
Yeah, do tell, because I
want to know yours.
I could riff, but it sounds like you've thought about this more than I have. So go on.
I think it's Stan was running away from his ethnic past, especially from his parents, and didn't want to have to think about himself that way. Jack writes a lot more about Judaism in his art and in his own, in his work than Stan does. So obviously, like, as we said, so
a lot
of the story is really coming from him. But
I was about to say that's the complicating factor is, Kirby always claimed that the stories were 90% to 100% his being Kirby's, and that he just sort of dictated to Stan what was going to happen, and maybe they had a brief conversation afterward, and that was about it. So we don't really know how much either man was contributing to those early X-Men issues when that was the pairing the creative pairing that was still on it. And they really couldn't make it work. You go back and read those early issues and they're hilarious in a lot of ways. Like, they're delightful, but they are, you can't beat Magneto writing that cute little curly Q handwriting in the air saying like, surrender by midnight, Magneto. And there's like you expect there to be a little heart on it or something, but but overall they really couldn't figure out what to do with the X-Men that was genuinely interesting. And anyway, maybe it was Stan not wanting to deal with it. Like, this is all complete, off the top of my head, I'm just pulling this out, but perhaps it was, Stan tempering Jack. But then again, Jack never said that he tried to create a metaphor with the X-Men, and he talked about creating the X-Men. There are some creations that just didn't come up all that often with Jack, but the X-Men, he said, he created, but he didn't say anything about like this was a metaphor for marginalized people or whatever. I mean, they were just sort of throwing out concepts back then. So perhaps it's not so much that either man was afraid of telling a Jewish story. Maybe it was just that just wasn't how their brains worked when it came to comics. Both of these men had been in the industry at that point for 20 odd years. More than that. But I'm bad at math. They've been in it for decades, and they had definitely not been writing Jewish characters, or writing minority characters with any kind of regularity. So it may just well have been like, well, why didn't they think something that just would be completely outside of their experience, But again, this is all just me hypothesizing. It could be completely not that.
But, they have so many characters with outsider status, regardless of, subtext or text. And it is still funny to me that, like, Ditko Spider-Man is, like, so Jewish and Ditko isn't Jewish, kind of, like, broke my brain. But
Yeah. I mean, yes. It's, Spider-Man and his Jewishness is a whole other topic that maybe we can get to later. But yes.
So it's complicated.
It's complicated. Yeah, it's a good question from Spencer. I wish I had a better answer. Neither man really, at least as far as I'd seen, got too much into, why. Actually, I take that back. There's an interview Stan did that was in Tom DeFalco's X-Men writers, I can't remember exactly the title, but it's, writers talk about X-Men. It's a really good, interesting book of interviews. I haven't read it in forever, so I'm actually drawing a blank on exactly what Stan says, but I'm sure Tom asks him or asked him, why did this wind down? So dear listener, if you're trying to find an answer to that question, I recommend seeking out Tom DeFalco's writers talk about X-Men. There's probably something.
Yeah. what was your favorite? What is the best interview you'd seen with Stan from all the archival stuff that you looked at for this?
That's an interesting question. In general, Stan's interviews were, what I found was that they're not super useful as a source of true information. I mean, everything
really?
Right, I know. And virtually, it was like one of those fact check things where you just keep going and you're like, well, that's not true. That's a complete fabrication, or that's very doubtful, and then that's an exaggeration. And by the time you're done, there's very little he's said in the interview that like is all that useful from a purely factual standpoint. But in terms of interview quality and the interesting stuff, there's Q&As that he's done, but one of my favorite interviews is, I haven't read the raw transcript of the interview, but the quotes that she got was Robin Greene, his former secretary's account of Marvel that she wrote for Rolling Stone after she stopped working for Stan. She's a brilliant writer and a very good reporter, it appears, because she got great stuff out of Stan, including this amazing quote that I found really fascinating from a kind of political standpoint, where she got him to say, like, if there's one message to his comics, it's for Christ's sake, or not Christ's sake, for goodness sake, something like that. Don't be bigoted. Now that quote has been excerpted a lot, and you just end it there, and it seems like, oh wow, okay, so he's standing up for, against racism or hatred or whatever. And no, the rest of the quote is him saying, he's talking about the right and the left, the extreme right and the extreme left. Like, if you're a John Bircher, don't think that all the hippies are coming to rape your daughter. That is the quote he actually uses. And if you're a leftist, don't think that all of the conservatives have horns, I believe is what he says. And it's like, that's what bigotry is to you. I shouldn't judge too much. I mean, we all have our different stances on things. But for me, it just was an interesting thing that when people excerpt it, they often leave out the second part, which sort of shows that it was completely about something else. There are a lot of quotes like that in that article from Robin's interview. She just had a real rapport with him. Was the rare person who was really had a great relationship with him that predated her being a journalist interviewing him, but who was also actually really good at writing and being a journalist. So that's one that sticks out in my mind.
I mean, and frankly, his both sides take, it does show up in his work. Like, you see that in the Stan soapbox columns and stuff like that.
Yeah, there's a lot in, not just in the soapbox, I mean, in the actual stories too. Ones that came in the era when Stan was having more undoubtable writing influence on a lot of the titles because Ditko and Kirby were gone, and that sort of first generation were gone. He would be writing these stories where they were dealing usually with campus radicalism. That was the big topic he often came back to, and it would be Spider-Man or Captain America going to deal with some kind of campus protest, because this is the late 60s. I mean, I believe those stories were 68 and 69. Campus protests were really serious business, and very bad things would happen at them. And what was interesting is, although Stan is sort of held up as this counterculture hero, you read those stories, and in both cases, it ends with this real the far right, the far left, or, the hippies and the establishment, whatever, they shake hands and meet somewhere in the middle. Or in the case of the Spider-Man story, they get carted off. Everybody gets carted off to jail. And Spider-Man muses that this will be great because it'll give them an opportunity to cool off. It's a very weird ending. It's not anything's really been resolved. And the best part is just that police force has subdued everybody, and now they'll see the error of their ways. And it's interesting because, he was being lionized by people who really wouldn't just be on much more the hippie end, right? Would not really want to meet in the middle with anybody from the establishment. But Stan could kind of have it both ways. It's sort of remarkable and a testament to his outreach and salesmanship. Yeah.
Yeah. He was a tremendous communicator.
Oh my God.
That's why it worked.
Yeah. I mean, when you talk to, whenever I interviewed people who were young in the 60s reading Marvel back then, I'd always ask so what kept you coming back? What was unique about Marvel back then? And I swear to God, more often than not, the answer is not anything in the stories or the characters. It's, I loved the letter pages. Like, it was so cool to see yourself reflected either directly if you got a letter published, or indirectly because it was like other kids like you or teens like you, or eventually college students like you writing in. Those letters pages were just like a thrill. I mean, there weren't things like that. There were like fanzines, but fanzines were not like the actual printed work where the letters are being answered by the person you're regarding as sort of the godhead of this whole operation. So if you were young reading these comics back in the 60s, there's a really good chance that that relationship he was building with you as a raconteur in those in the back matter, where he's like doing the soapbox or answering letters or, you know, just listing what's coming up soon, his way with language and his ability to empathize and connect with people was really tremendous and enormously instrumental in his success.
Yeah. I mean, did DC Comics letter page just not have the same?
Didn't have the same
caliber?
No, it was like
vibe?
It was like Dear Editor stuff, and it was, yeah, it's not like the things were.
Doesn't have the personality.
It didn't have the personality. I was about to say, I don't want to throw DC letters pages completely under the bus. I'm kind of an establishment type sometimes myself. But that said, they did not have the like word jazz and personal touch that the Marvel letters pages did back then. The closest equivalent would have been the relationship that some EC comics, or a lot of EC comics actually had with fans, but it really had not been done in superhero comics before.
I mean, yeah, like I guess Stan's brilliance was really about being one of the constructors of modern fandom, basically.
Oh,
by
yeah.
developing the shared universe, developing like what is a fandom relationship, and like branding fan as an identity, basically. The Merry Marvel Marching
Merry Marvel Marching Society. Yeah. No, you're exactly right. I mean, I wish I had a word limit and also just didn't want to lose people who were lay people, but I could write a whole book just about Stan Lee and fandom. Like, that's just his fostering of it, his influence on it, and the ways it sort of then passed him by in a lot of ways. But like kept on holding on to some of the things that he'd pioneered. Because when you talk about fandom, if you look at it from that perspective, you don't doubt Stan's influence. I mean, that from a perspective of like community building and selling a product and making people want to interact with that product, he was unparalleled, and that stuff is really influential in the development of fandom, especially in the West. And in the English language, sorry, I shouldn't say the West, in America specifically, but it does bleed out elsewhere then. So yeah, I'm rambling now at this point. What?
No, that was it. I mean, and the thing for me is like, as like a Jack Kirby partisan, as we all should be, is like, we can recognize that Stan contributed something to Marvel, but that it wasn't what Stan said Stan contributed to Marvel.
Yeah. No, sure. Well, that's the thing. Well, that's what I wanted to convey in a lot of the book, is that like Stan did a lot, a tremendous amount, but something that was also true about him was he always boasted of things that were then much more dubious and sometimes outright false. And it's such an interesting case that I think a lot of us can relate to, where we just, you go that extra mile because you don't want to just you're not satisfied with just being really good at some things. You want to be good at like other specific things or kind of everything. And so, you smooth the corners sometimes. And, I don't want to make Stan out to be Satan incarnate, because I think that temptation is there for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Well, I feel like at a certain point, and I feel like this is something I got from your book as well. Like, he didn't even remember what, like, he'd repeated these lines so much, he didn't remember or even know what the truth was anymore, because he had this persona that he built up around it, and then was just like, doesn't fucking remember. He's an old man. He doesn't fucking remember.
No, there was so much that, and you get it. That gets at also the sort of fly by night nature of the comics industry back then among his generation. Like, they did not take it seriously necessarily as something that they needed to like document, like they weren't writing in their diaries at night, like, I just created this new character and, I have all these plans for it. Now maybe that was dispositional, but a lot of it was also just that, like, that wasn't how they thought about these comics. Like, comics was still this kind of trashy medium where there weren't extensive records kept about things. And of course that then leads to the larger questions about, like, how we can't figure out exactly who created what, because again, these things were not really being documented. That's the origin of a lot of the problems. It's frustrating.
Any clarity in his own mind?
No, for him, I think a lot of it was he didn't remember stuff. I think there was definitely stuff that he was, had done when it was too recent for him to have totally forgotten about it. But I'm sure by the end, there were a lot of aspects of his career, both positive and negative, that, he hadn't thought about too much when they were happening and may not have remembered, whether that's artistic or like the way he treated someone, So that's one of the reasons why you don't want to just rest on interviews that Stan did later in his career. You really want to go back to as early as you possibly can to when he's speaking contemporaneously to certain things happening. And that's where you might get stuff that is at least theoretically more reliable,
Well, and that's not to say, though, that there aren't things that we know demonstrably that he did when he was younger that are obviously fucked up. Pointing to the very deliberate union busting infiltration that he pulled on poor young idealistic Neil Adams.
Yeah, I know. I tried to have as much labor relations stuff in the book as I could, because I do feel like, this gets at our earlier point about how I'd love to see more, serious comics journalism in history, is you don't see the degree to which the comics industry is this labor basket case. I mean, it's just awful, and it remains that way to this day. It used to be in some ways even worse, or maybe better. I mean, it's never been great. I wanted to try and emphasize the fact that, like, yeah, it's a pretty unjust system. That's something where I didn't feel bad about lightly editorializing. I don't think comics is good for the people who put their labor into it, especially their creative labor.
And the work for hire system coming up against the shared universe is kind of the original sin of the comics industry in a way, right?
Completely. Once you say, like, these creations all don't live in what the creator wants to live in, the setting that they've created for them. They live in this mutual setting where the universe itself, the brand, supersedes everything, and everything you create is suddenly a citizen of this other country where you're not the king. You know what I mean? And the shared universe, for that reason and many other reasons, was this genius move. If you remove from any moral valence, it's a genius move. It accentuates what already was there in the way of work for hire, but in some subconscious way also enlists the fans on your side. I think about that a lot in terms of the current incarnations of superheroes, where, like, in 2014 there was a court case that almost made its way to the Supreme Court about the Kirby claims on his characters and the Marvel characters. And if it almost went to the Supreme Court, and if they had ruled in favor of the Kirbys, I think it would have just blown up the entertainment industry. I mean, it would have set this precedent.
I love it.
I know it would have been this. I mean, I don't know how much the Kirbys made in that settlement, but it must have been an ungodly sum, because, I mean, it really did have the potential to be this seismic event for the entertainment industry. And that's because, as soon as you start acknowledging the fact that these properties have been marketed, immorally, then it starts to fall apart. But what's interesting is, I wonder how fans would have reacted. Like, if Disney said, well, folks, we can't do the MCU anymore, sorry, and threw up their hands, fans probably would just riot, or even if they felt some kind of guilty conscience, I don't think the world would tolerate they would have to tolerate it. The Disney wouldn't be able to continue, but there would be such backlash, and that would be part of the seismic event. And I don't think people would necessarily look at and go, oh, wow, actually this is a good development because, the rights of the working people of the world are being respected finally. Like that's not, I think, how people would approach it.
Well, but here's the thing. Disney would never approach it this way. But if I was ruler of Disney, I can totally figure out ways to give creators financial and artistic credit for their creations while keeping them in a shared universe with each other. Like, it's complicated, but there was by no means is it impossible.
No, it's not impossible.
You just have
but
to fucking give a fuck, and they never did.
I don't think they would want to. I mean, this is all hypothetical, but
Sure.
I also don't think that the price tag would probably be too high for them. I don't think they would necessarily be able to be in a position to negotiate that stuff. But anyway, it's all hypothetical. My larger point was just, I do think there's, Stan created this thing, the combination, as you pointed out, of work for hire in the shared universe, where you really create this addiction maneuver, mechanism, whatever, and people don't take kindly to withdrawal from that. And, it's again, removed from any kind of valence of whether you think it's a good idea or a bad idea. That combination was very potent.
You have a wonderful quote in the book that was Ebert uses the line that movies are like a machine to create empathy. Stan's line of comics was a machine designed to create addiction.
It was.
Man,
oh,
so
thank
good.
you. I appreciate that. But it's true. I mean, it was, and it's still, it works now for the MCU and doesn't work so much for the people that don't know how to properly apply it, aka like, dark universe or whatever. It's hard to make it work, but if you can make it work, oh my God, you are in for a pretty penny. It was revolutionary. I mean, there really were not examples of things. I mean, I was recently on a Jewish podcast. We were talking about the comparison point being, the actual like Bible, because the Bible is also comprised of all these disparate texts by disparate authors that are nonetheless held together to be a part of the same world and the same work. And there are contradictions that like you smooth over with, we'd call them no prizes, but the rabbis would call them, discourse in the Mishnah and the Gemara, and you end up with, and there's like uncertain authorship. So that's the only thing I can think that overlaps with it. And it's certainly, not the most irrelevant comparison because, biblical, attachment to biblical texts and attachment to superhero texts these days are, things that are differences of degree, not necessarily of distinction,
And like, look who was making comics is coming from Jewish writers, Jewish artists, like especially in the early days. So absolutely makes sense.
I know it does. I don't know. Maybe that is, maybe it doesn't, but it's interesting.
I mean, who else is there? There's Carmine Infantino. It's Italian. It's kind of like
yeah.
Like
well,
adjacent,
and you got Ditko, Ditko from the Balkan Slavs. Yeah.
So here we are. One of the interesting things from this also is from your book, is how clearly Stanley did not really respect comics as an art form itself. And, he basically stopped reading comics as soon as he could get away with like stopping reading comics, basically. And I'm charmed by his relationship with French New Wave director Alain Resnais of Hiroshima Mon Amour fame, and he's like this, this high art director comes to Stan and then says, I love your work, because of course the French have taken comics seriously for a long time.
Yeah.
And Stan is like, I'm embarrassed of comics, but I love you as a validator of me. Let's go make projects together. And then the projects they make together are fucking bonkers.
Yeah. The inmates.
And not in the good way.
The Inmates and the Monster Maker. Yes. Pretty wild pitches. And they didn't really go anywhere, but yeah, Stan wanted out. I mean, as early as 1945, when he gets back, he didn't really go anywhere, but, once he finishes his service in World War II, immediately you have him trying to start a textbook company with Random House. And it doesn't go anywhere, but that's like an indicator of, and then throughout the 40s and 50s, that, impulse only increases. He's trying to get into newspaper comics or TV or radio or advertising. And he just did, by his own admission, until the Marvel years, he did not care about comics, did not care about that job, did not care about writing. That's him actually saying that, like in his memoir and in some other places, but especially in the memoir. And then we're supposed to believe that just sort of abruptly everything changes and he loves the comics industry in the 60s. Now, he probably does on some level because the comics industry was being great to him right then. Mm-hmm. But what you have to reckon with is like he then, even during the 60s, he kept trying to escape comics. There were all these professional stabs that he took, ranging from, all the way to ranging all the way to a political talk show that he filmed a pilot for in 1968, where he was like talking to student journalists or young journalists from the radical, fringe, and not all of them, but some of them, and just sort of shooting them down as being, ill-considered whatevers. So yeah, Stan wanted to get into other things. And comics was never really his passion. I mean, he would diss the comics industry. He would diss comics readers privately. I mean, there's this amazing recording of him talking to Alain Resnais and his wife over dinner. I could not tell you for the life of me why they recorded this. But they just recorded reel-to-reel tape of them talking to Alain that night. And Alain, as you pointed out, yes, he's French, so he understands bande dessinée, comics, but he says he just doesn't understand people who only read comics. And Stan, right, and Stan,
nor do I. But.
Nor do I, yes. And Stan jumps in and goes like, I can't, doesn't even just say people who only read comics. He goes, and I can't understand people who read comics. Not just, it's just, he was like, if I wouldn't read them, if I had the time to not have to read them. And it's really crazy to hear. And it's so revealing. I mean, why would maybe he's trying to impress Alain, but it feels very passionate and heartfelt and goes along with other statements he made over the years that really dissed the comics industry and the comics medium. He wanted to do movies. He wanted to be well known as this great writer of novels or poetry or whatever. So anyway, yeah, go ahead.
It also shows why when he actually did have to try to write stuff on his own later, it was bad. It's because you can't write a good comic if you don't like comics.
That's the thing. I mean, it's hard to, although he didn't, I mean, he did, I guess there were some comics here and there, but you're right. When he was doing them, they were often just very weird. I mean, for one thing, he hadn't really figured out how to update his style, which was, difficult, but also, yeah, his approach to writing was, I don't want to put on a critic hat, but like sometimes it could be like, it didn't feel as naturalistic in, 2009 as it did in 1969, and that's not just him not updating with the times. I think it's also like that may have been, this is just sort of hypothesizing, that may have been the limit of how much he wanted to invest in learning about how comics work and how to update his style or whatever. He had the formula that had worked for him, and he just sort of kept going with that. And, again, that's not a crime. It's just something that you sort of have to reckon with and incorporate into your larger understanding of who he was.
One of the interesting things that you wrote about was Stan had this obsession with doing photo books that had different captioned
photos. Yes.
And I'm like, oh my God, Stan Lee kind of made meme culture before his time.
That's brilliant. A lot of them do read like memes. That's a great point. I should have said that in the book. You're a genius. But like, yeah, they are, because it'll just be this like existing news photo or famous piece of artwork. Those were sort of, or cheesecake photo. And there will be, a brief caption that could just easily have been in impact font at 24 point on the image on Twitter. So yeah, but the memes did not catch on. He did not go viral with them really ever, and he was trying them from the 50s up until 2008. And everywhere in between. It's this really fascinating through line that once you start collating all the data, you start to see.
Maybe if he had been trying them again in the meme age of today, he would have found his audience.
Exactly. Could have gotten really into boomer humor or something. Yeah.
Oh my God, that's crazy. One of the other things is that you delved into in the book were two of the really pivotal pieces of journalism written about Stan at the time, and how they impacted Stan's life. And one of those was the Sally Kempton piece in the Village Voice. That seemed like it was kind of the first piece to validate superhero comics as a artistic, like as a thing that smart people could read, basically.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. Sally Kempton, who was a young writer then, she wrote this really interesting essay. It wasn't really a reported essay. It was based on reading comics and sort of keeping her ear to the ground. But she was talking about this idea of pop culture cults, which now I guess we would call fandom and fandoms. And, she's speaking about them, although the word cult has negative connotations, she's speaking about them pretty lovingly and says that, and it's all building up to her saying, one pop culture cult that's really worth paying attention to is that of Marvel. And the article is really useful because you're right, it does provide this force that helps validate Marvel and validate Stan. But it also ends up being a document that has information about how people were approaching it. Because she's not saying I discovered Marvel. She's saying like the people in the village are talking about Marvel, or like, the kids on college campuses are talking about Marvel. So it's really the first time we have reporting of some kind, even though it's kind of vague reporting about the kinds of things that people were more ephemerally engaging with when it came to Marvel, things that maybe are not preserved, but that at the time, or can't be, because it's like a conversation that happened and either people overheard it and reported it or not. So anyway, the Sally Kempton is an interesting document. It's also fun to look at it in its original, somebody scanned a PDF of the actual pages it was printed on, and just looking at the ads in the Village Voice from 1964 it's adorable and amazing. It's like Balkan folk dancing lessons and like a lot of anti-war protests. And you're just like, God bless be fun to go visit that period for at least a couple of days.
And the other piece of journalism is the famous Times Herald article that just really alienated
Kirby.
Jack
Herald Tribune.
Yes. And you went and you interviewed the author of that article.
I know.
Had anybody interviewed him before?
No. I can't even remember if I ended up putting this in the book. I probably ran out of flow and room, but I did basically tell him for the first time that article had any impact. He had no idea. He had absolutely no idea.
Didn't know.
No, he had no
clue. Okay, for folks
clue.
who don't know what I'm talking about,
go ahead.
So there was an article in which, a journalist from a mainstream publication came to Marvel and toured around and basically wrote something very dismissive about Jack, saying I couldn't tell the difference between him and a girdle factory foreman, which for the record is anti-Semitic.
I never thought about that, but it totally is anti-Semitic. Well, I shouldn't necessarily say that. It's definitely, it can be read that way.
I don't know that the guy meant it that way, but it's anti-Semitic. It's this person is a working class Jewish person, and therefore
in the garment industry.
Therefore, they work in the garment industry, and they're not a serious visual artist. And meanwhile, Stanley is this visionary, and the article, Jack and Roz saw it, and it was like Roz Kirby were like, "Fuck Stanley! I can't believe you would dismiss my artistic create like this," and it sort of solidified in the public's mind that the artists were just technicians and that Stan was a genius.
Yep.
And nobody had interviewed the journalist. Good God.
Yeah, no, he was hard to track down previously, but then I think, I'm going to disappoint you because I can't remember the exact story of how I got his contact information. When I'm searching for someone in, the various databases that are available, I kind of go into a fugue state and emerge with names in my hands and blood all around, and I don't know what happened. But I found him somehow. I tried to find him back when I wrote this initial profile of Stan that ran in 2016, but to no avail. And then somehow that I wish I could remember, I stumbled across his email address, and I emailed him and said, the thing that I think may have helped was at some point I realized that he was misspelling his name deliberately in his byline. That was not his legal name. It was his pen name. And so it was Friedland, and he spelled it as a byline with 2 E's, but it was really IE. So I found his email address and emailed him. And initially he said, no, he didn't want to talk to me. He said, like, sounds somewhat interesting, but I just don't want to get into anything. And I wrote back, and this is one of the only times this has ever worked in any context in my life. I basically just wrote back and said, pretty please. Like, I had no additional tout. Like, I had no other thing that I could offer him. I was just like, come on, really? I would love it if you'd talk to me. And he was like, okay, fine. So he calls me and just goes, this is Nat. What do you want? What do you want? And he's this kind of like, he was very nice, but he is this sort of, older journalist from a previous era. And we had this fascinating conversation. It was really 2 conversations that shed a lot of light on what had happened there. My plan is, if the book does well, I'm going to start releasing full transcripts of interviews that I did for it. I have to work out exactly how that would work. I probably have to get people's permission for that, because they did not sign up for a Q&A. They signed up for me excerpting things. But if I can get people to agree with it, and I would hope, one of my hopes is that Nat would be okay with that, because I'd love to share for comics historians the full conversation we had about that article, because it really is this seminal piece for a lot of reasons, as you've pointed out. And people, again, like I said, Nat had no clue. He told me a lot of stuff that he remembered, but he had seen the obituary for Stan that ran in Wired, or not obituary, an article after Stan died that Wired had run. He was like, oh, right, Stan Lee. Hadn't thought about him since I wrote that article, basically. Oh, I guess he was more complicated than I thought. And then I contacted him a few weeks or months later, however long it was. And I told him, yeah, so your article had this big impact. I presume you know that. And he goes, nope, had no idea. I have no idea what you're talking about. And like, this is like in all of the history of comics journalism, there are like I would say maybe 2 articles that rise to the level of importance that, there are 2 articles that rise to that like top level Omega mutant, level of importance. And one is the New York Herald Tribune article, and the other is the interview with Jack Kirby that ran in the Comics Journal in 1990, but was conducted in 1989. Right. Those are like the moments where journalism about comics, for good or ill, really changed the shape of comics in a lot of ways. And they're fascinating documents to revisit, both of them.
It's interesting because I have strong recollections of the soapbox columns from when Jack died in like 90, and like, because I was reading comics, recently, I guess, reading comics when that had happened. And so it was interesting because the comics understood that they had to regard Jack as a seminal figure that everybody cared about, that was extremely important, but they couldn't admit like, oh, by the way, he basically invented the MCU. Like, well, there was no CU at the time, but he basically invented the 616. But it was an interesting moment because they realized that they had to treat these other creators seriously, but they couldn't quite get to the next level on
the step. No, I mean,
and that was after the Jack. That was after the Comics Journal interview.
Sure, yeah. I mean, when Jack dies in the early 90s. There's a lot of bad blood between him and Stan and him and Marvel. And Jack's a fascinating contradictory figure in a lot of ways. And one of them is he really hated Stan and Marvel, but also was capable of being extremely nice to them and about them. But then occasionally, if you got him really talking for an extended period of time, or even not that extended period of time, he would sort of cheerfully tell you, like, yeah, Marvel is like the SS, or like, yeah, Stan Lee is a complete fraud, and he would say this according to his assistant, Steve Sherman. He would say this kind of stuff. And then the next day, he'd just be like back to, even just the minute the tape recorder stopped running, Jack would just sort of be back to like whatever his mood had been before the interview.
Yeah.
These things did not get him emotionally incensed. It was more just ideologically, he just completely felt like these were criminal acts that had been done. He just was not really a rageful guy all that much and didn't really get high on like drama. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. it definitely just comes off like, and it's a personality trait I've seen before. To me, I'm like, oh, that doesn't seem contradictory. I know people like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the thing I don't even I feel like this is just a saying that everyone's had at this point, like without even attribution, is like, as we all know, like Jack Kirby working solo makes the fourth world, and Stanley working solo makes Stripperella.
Right.
Like it makes it very clear like who's on what level here.
Yeah, but, I mean, you don't want to rule. I mean, just so the listeners know, people who haven't read the book, Ilana is more certain than I am about the authorship of the Marvel Universe and all the characters, which I completely totally respect that. I just, the views of the host do not necessarily reflect mine. But yeah, you make a compelling case when you talk about the fourth world and Stripperella, which is the common sort of comparison point. And it's all circumstantial evidence, but it's stuff that you sort of have to incorporate and that has not been acknowledged in the official history,
Yeah, and as I said here, though, I completely acknowledged Stanley was a fucking genius for thinking of the shared universe. Like, there's as a marketer and as a he was brilliant. To just not brilliant at everything,
right?
One of the things you also went into is trying to get to the bottom of the origin of the best line Stan ever wrote, which was, of course, with great power must also come great responsibility, and like trying to be like, is it from the French? Is it from
the National Convention? Right.
I think you're right, but I think ultimately you're sort of saying it came from the ether of our culture as a whole, from all these various sources, Well,
what I say in the book is like, it's entirely possible that it came from the cultural ether and Stan just happened to be in convergent evolution, or he could have ripped somebody off. I mean, one of the speeches was Churchill and another was, speeches where this phrase had been used. One was Churchill, another was FDR. Stan was certainly like alive and aware and smart enough to be reading stuff that those men said. So it's definitely not beyond the realm of possibility that he just sort of lifted it. But I'm not accusing him necessarily of that. I'm just saying it's a possibility we have to consider, because there really are, these other quotes just basically are that. There are different dressing around it, but it's literally the words power and responsibility. And like with power comes responsibility. So again, it could be convergent evolution, or maybe it's something else.
And the way it's deployed in the story is ultimately what's so powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's just, I fixated on the phrase just because that's the one phrase anybody can quote from Stan Lee, which is fascinating. Like, here's this guy who's held up as one of the great writers of the 20th century. And if you ask anybody to quote him, best you can come up with is, with great power comes great responsibility, which of course is a misquote. So it's fascinating. Like, there are very few things that really get cited, but that one gets so disproportionately cited that it felt like, digging into the language was something important.
Of the really bonkers ideas from the later period, where they were coming up, where Stan and Elaine or various other people were coming up with bonkers new concepts, which of them were you like the most like, that might have actually been kind of cool?
You mean the stuff that he would come up with outside, like extracurricularly, or like
I'm looking at this list. Okay, this is from the book, dear listeners. Rocky's Carl Weathers, starring in a Luke Cage movie. A Daredevil TV show written by Oscar-winning Sterling Siliphant. Tom Selleck as Doctor Strange. An X-Men movie, who could have imagined? A Human Torch movie, a Spider-Man movie done by Roger Corman. Angela Bowie as a Marvel super spy, the Black Widow.
Yes, that's the one I most wanted to happen, because can you imagine the drama of fricking Angie Bowie being Black Widow and like having to be on a film set with and Stan would have been much more involved with that one, because that was during the period when he was actually in charge of this sort of stuff. So like Stan interacting with Angie Bowie during a bad day on set is something that I would give anything to be a fly on the wall in an alternate universe for.
Yeah. But also the fact that he knew who she was, right? Like, he's not a boomer, right?
No, this may well have been you never know. I don't know how he and Angie Bowie first made contact, but there were definitely people who you'd be surprised that Stan would make contact with, but he'd literally just be at a party and someone would say, oh, this is person X, so-and-so is really famous for Y, or is really rich because of this. And Stan, especially if they were famous, he was very much, as Peter Paul, one of his cohorts, said, he was a celebrity geek. So if he met somebody who you told him was famous, he would start talking to you about how, you could collaborate or whatever. And, that's how Stripperella, speaking of Stripperella, came to be. I mean, he was talking to Pamela Anderson's brother at a party, and the topic of, well, you're Pam Anderson's brother. What if we came up with a superhero identity for Pam? Came up, and that turned into Stripperella. It's a longer story than that, but you wouldn't expect Stan and Pam Anderson to necessarily be in the same circles. But Stan would sometimes just sort of be in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, yeah. You have some stories of just crazy stuff that I'd never heard before, like the Carnegie Hall show, for example.
Oh, yeah, the Carnegie Hall show is wild.
The Carnegie Hall debacle, as it were. But.
Yeah. The Stan in the early 70s did a one night only show at Carnegie Hall where it was this tribute to him, basically, not even a tribute to Marvel. It was the brainchild of Steve Lemberg, this guy who held a lot of the rights for Marvel and other media at the time. And it was this total disaster. It was this weird smattering of different kinds of acts. There was, this bit where Stan would read lines from comics while Roy Thomas, his protege's rock band, would play, and, and secretaries in costumes would start drawing things. There was a point where they had jazz music, and then there was Stan's daughter and wife reading a long poem he'd written called God Woke, this long philosophical poem. There was a moment where Dr. Doom came in and stole Stan, and a voice came on and said everybody, you have to sing the Merry Marvel marching song to bring Stan back. And there's just deafening silence because, A, nobody's having a good time, and B, it's not like these people have necessarily memorized it all and are ready to park it out.
Yeah.
And the world's tallest man was there, and Tom Wolfe was there. It was just this truly bizarre night. And it was this disaster, and Stan really felt awful after the show was done. And I don't know how much of an impact that had on his psyche, but you have to imagine it must have been something that was difficult for him and left some kind of scar, however small or large.
There's a great question we were sent by Chase Magnet.
I love Chase.
What aspect of Lee's life was it most difficult to obtain primary sources for, and how did you overcome that hurdle?
Well, I guess there's two ways to answer that. First, there's the documents that exist that I couldn't get, and then there's the things that I wish there were documents of that I couldn't get. And the documents that don't exist that I couldn't get, obviously the hardest to find would have been things that, I shouldn't say they don't exist. They probably don't exist. Things that prove the authorship of these characters. But as far as things that do exist, let me think. Hardest documentation to obtain. Well, I think it was probably stuff from before stuff that had from the Lee archives that had not been donated to the archive, from the Lee home family that had not been donated to the Lee archives in Wyoming. Why they're in Wyoming is a whole other story. But those things.
Why are they in Wyoming?
Okay. Well, in 1981, 80, I can't remember which year it was. The director of the AHC reached out to Stan, who was not super famous in the mainstream at that point, and said, do you want to donate your papers and recordings to us? And Stan, the story goes, asked, well, who else is in there? And they listed some people. And when they got to Jack Benny, he said, well, if it's good enough for Jack Benny, it's good enough for me. So,
love it.
But also you have to remember that people were not really asking much for his papers at this point. So it may just have been that they were sort of the first to ask and were in the right place at the right time. But anyway, whatever the logic was or the story behind it, Stan then donated stuff. Stan and his wife, Joan, donated stuff to the University of Wyoming starting in the early 80s, all the way up to about 2011. And it now resides in about just under 200 boxes worth of materials resides in the AHC in Laramie, and anybody can go. It's free of charge. I mean, you have to reserve some time and space, whatever, but you can just go do it. And the trouble is getting out there. I mean, there's no direct flights to Laramie. I mean, you have to fly to Denver and then take a either, 5 a.m. flight or a 10 p.m. flight to get to and from Denver. It's rather inconvenient, but it's a wealth of material. I mean, it's insane the amount of stuff that's in there. And I'm very lucky that Stan and Joan, for whatever reason, were so generous with. I mean, sure, there were things that. Well, this gets back to what I was saying before. I'm sure there were things I was not able to get because I did not have the cooperation of the Lee estate. And that's frustrating because especially things from before the 60s, any materials or photos or documents or whatever that might exist, those did not end up for the most part in the archives. So maybe those things don't exist, but I would imagine some stuff survived. And I was not, because of the difficulty of getting any kind of cooperation with the Lee estate, that was not able to happen. I'm trying to think what's something that I actually did find. Well, it's not a document, but hearing the the semi-clandestinely recorded audio tapes of Stan that Kia Morgan, his associate from late in his life, had recorded. That was something that took a lot of work that, I won't reveal the whole tradecraft, but that, he had told me very early in our communications that he had those recordings, and then really kept teasing me with the prospect of listening to them for months and months. And it took a lot of persistence and communication to be able to get to a point where I was able to hear them. But that was something that throughout the process, I was thinking, I really hope I get to hear this stuff. And then, ultimately I was able to break through the barriers and have that happen.
That's really wild. We got a good question from Chris Arant, who said,
I love all these people. This is great.
Yeah, I got some good questions then. This is published after Lee's death. If you had a chance to ask him one question and get an honest answer, what would it be? Wow. And what do you think the answer would be?
Well, I mean, obviously you'd want to ask about, I feel like we have to say a question other than who created the characters, right? I mean,
yes. A question. We've covered that.
Right. That's a little too easy. I mean, personally, just based on my interests, I'm not sure exactly which question I would choose, but it'd be something about his family and his heritage. Either his Jewish background, like what he remembers about Jewishness from growing up. That's something I guess I would ask him if he were, the lasso of truth were around him and he had to actually give me an honest answer. I would want to know, what are your actual feelings about Jewishness and your Jewish upbringing? Beyond the deflections, beyond the, well, that isn't something I think about that much. What were his actual thoughts about why Jewishness was something he didn't want to engage with? And what did that have to do with, the Jewishness that was expressed in his family? So maybe that's just my private little crusade, but I would love to.
No, that's what I want too.
Oh, really?
If I'm not gonna, if I'm not gonna ask him about like the actual labor practices and ownership of the art, I want to know that too. One of the things that broke my heart reading this book is his poor brother, Larry Lieber. I remember, not even realizing that had been his brother when I was younger reading stuff. And I feel so bad. What can be done for poor Larry Lieber at this juncture? Yeah,
Larry, I will say Larry is looked after enough. I mean, there are comics professionals really care about him and look after him, so you don't have to worry too much about him.
Okay, I'm glad to hear that.
But yeah, in terms of his emotional arc, it was a lot of stuff that was very hard to hear. We had 2 long interviews. One was 4 hours and the other was about an hour and a half. And especially in the first one, the 4-hour one, which was in his apartment, just 40 odd days after Stan's death, he cried a lot. It was a very intense interview and conversation. And we went off the record a bunch of times because there was stuff he wanted to share that, I will never share, but that was even more tragic than the stuff that was actually said on the record. And, I tended to find Larry to be a more trustworthy source than the average bear because, especially when it came to the comics industry, Larry really does not care about comics. Even he actively dislikes that he had a career in comics. I mean, that's just what he has said to me. I mean, he wishes he'd been a serious artist or whatever, or a novelist, and that's similar to Stan. But Larry's response is not to contra Stan. His response is not to then inflate his own importance. It's to denigrate himself and just say, well,
yeah,
I'm not really worth anything, and I didn't create anything good. And I wouldn't worry too much about him, but it's definitely a story that is hard to hear, and I'm very grateful to Larry that he was so generous with his time and let me hear a lot of the stuff. I mean, he kept saying the magic words that every journalist wants to hear when they're interviewing someone, which is, I've never told this to anyone before. And I really, I can't be, I really express my gratitude to him for being so generous with his time and thoughts.
And he gets the last word.
He does get the last word, which we won't spoiler, but yes.
No. And what a word it is. And if I was a better host, I would make that be the end of the podcast. But I actually have one other thing I want to talk with you about, which was, what was your impressions and thoughts of Stanley as a kid reading or young person? Or however,
Yeah, sure. So I first became aware of Stan not so much from comics, but from the Marvel Action Hour, the animated series that ran in the early 90s. It's the least known of that era of Marvel cartoons. But he did these little live action intros for every episode because the episodes were about sort of the odds and ends of the Marvel universe as of then. So like Iron Man and the Hulk, which were not as popular as X-Men and Spider-Man. And so they wanted, the creators of the show wanted to have some kind of through line. Specifically, this was the idea, I at least reportedly, of his friend Ron Friedman. They decided to give a through line for kids so they would know that at least one thing was going to be consistent from episode to episode. It was that there would be Stan doing these little live action intros. So you could always depend on old Stan. He would always be there. And so I didn't have a particularly emotional response to him, but it etched itself in my mind just in terms of his performance, because the character of Stan Lee, which he was performing there, which was very much not who he was in behind closed doors, is so it's so immediately grabby for a kid. You see, he's like, he could have been a children's television show host if he wanted to.
Yeah.
He has that vibe and has that rapport with young people who feel like, this is a guy who's not threatening. This is a guy who likes me. This is a guy who wants me to be happy and wants everybody to be happy and get along with each other. It's this really powerful image and sound and everything. And that was my first exposure to him. And it wasn't really until a few years after that, in late grade school, when I started reading Marvel comics and not just watching the cartoons, that I started to become much more aware of Stan, because that was still in the days of Stan Lee Presents in every issue, so, and Stan would be a character occasionally. I mean, there was this event that Marvel did in, I think it was 96, 97, called Marvel Number Zero, where they just released a bunch of Number Zero issues of comics. So it was like prequels to issue 1 of these things. And Stan was the host of every Number Zero comic. Like, there was this sort of, cartoon Stan who would say, like, hello, true believers, welcome to this crazy tale of Magneto and Charles Xavier before X-Men #1. And so I grew familiar with him there. And then, especially once I started reading Wizard, the comics magazine, started reading my first bits of comics journalism, although sometimes the journalism was more serious than other times, there were interviews with Stan and information about what Stan had done. And that was really when I started to actually get a sense of who he was. And, again, I never really had a deep emotional connection with the character of Stan Lee that a lot of people did. But I did meet him once, and we included a photo from it in the book, the only photo of it. I went to the Wizard World Comics Convention in Rosemont, Illinois, outside of Chicago. It was, I believe, 1998, although the photo's undated. I'm virtually certain it's 1998. I went there, and Stan was doing a signing. And this was a very different time in the comics industry and the superhero industrial complex history as well. Stan was not world famous. He had not started, he'd done like little cameos and random things, but the like Marvel movie cameo thing had not begun. And Marvel was not big. Marvel had this really strong beginning of the decade and then had cratered and gone into bankruptcy and all of that. So Stan was doing a signing, and I only had to wait in line for like, I don't remember exactly, but it was like maybe a half hour, and I didn't have to pay anything. I just went up and handed him something to sign, which is crazy by the standards of his late life, where he had this whole machine set up, largely engineered by his manager and associate and close friend, Max Anderson, where he would charge a lot of money, both from the venue or from the con rather, and then also from people who wanted to get signatures. And the lines would be, you'd have to wait all day. But for me at that con, I just sort of waited in line a little bit, and I handed him a beat up copy of Fantastic Four number 47, which I had purchased, I believe, earlier that day just for him to sign it. And he did. And as he's signing it, my mom took out this little disposable camera that I had brought, and she took a picture of the two of us. And so the photo exists. It's just, there it is. It's him signing, and I'm standing in front of him at the table. And I'm not making the next part up. It's so weird that I don't know why I would make it up. It would sound very silly. Stan looks at me and then after the flash goes off, he looks at me and then he looks at my mom and he says, "You've immortalized me," which is a very weird thing.
Wow.
I know. It was a very, in retrospect, very strange thing that occurred. It probably means nothing, but that was my that was my one encounter with Stan Lee one-on-one. I did a brief email interview with him when I wrote that profile that was released in 2016, but it was, an email interview and all the questions were bowdlerized and it was brief. And then I got to ask him a question at a press conference Q&A. But other than that, the closest we ever came, not including that, the closest we ever came was I believe in 1998 at the Wizard World convention. And it's so bizarre that photo exists, but my mom held on to it and we found it a few years ago and we figured, why the hell not? Let's put it in the book. So it's in there.
Love it. That's wonderful. Well, thanks so much for joining us for this conversation. I do want to have you back on sometime as just part of my roundtables where we talk about one of the shows or movies or comic series, etc.
I would love that. This was a really interesting conversation, and we're clearly cut from similar cloth when it comes to the way we think about this stuff. So keep up the good work.
Oh, thank you. And so for our listeners, when is the book going to be available to everyone else?
Yeah. So the book comes out February 16th. If you want to pre-order it, just go to abrahamriesman.com. It's R-I-E, so Abraham, RIESMAN.com. If you do misspell the I and the E and transpose them, I have that domain also registered, so it'll redirect you.
Good job.
But yeah, you can pre-order through there and find me on various social platforms as well. But yeah, February 16th, pre-order now.
And yeah, Twitter, you're Abraham Joseph.
At Abraham Joseph, correct.
As for me, I'm on Twitter a little bit too much. ELANA_Brooklyn is my handle. And my new Star Trek Deep Space Nine podcast, Deep Space Dive, does indeed continue with some amazing conversations coming up around colonialism, capitalism, and Judaism and Star Trek, and just a whole host of nerdy things about a fucking gorgeous, brilliant television show from the 90s that is as vital today as it was before. And as always, go to graphicpolicy.com for comics news and reviews and comics journalism. And as we like to say, keep it geeky.
Hey, thanks for watching the previous video from Graphic Policy Television. Just by watching, you help support our site. Thank you so much. Now, if you're watching these videos, you probably care about geeky things like movies, television, comic books, toys, games, video games, you name it. You can go and subscribe right now to our YouTube channel to stay in touch and catch all the new videos, or check out our website at graphicpolicy.com. There's a nice link on this end of the video. But as always, thank you for watching. Keep on rocking and keep it geeky.